All right, so last week we took a look at all the different options you have if you want to learn to play. You can learn to read written music, you can figure things out by ear, you can memorize, you can sight read, you can do all these different things. This week, I just want to look at why would you choose one over the other? And if you do, like say you decide I'm going to learn everything by ear, what is that going to look like down the road? 2 years from now, what are you going to be good at and what are you not going to be good at? Now, just a warning, I have a feeling this is going to be one of those grab a drink and get comfortable kind of lessons. There's quite a lot that I want to cover, so just know that going into it. All right. Now, right off the bat, you might think, I don't care too much. I'll just learn everything. I'll get good at all of this, and then I'll be super well-rounded, and I can just do whatever it is I want to do. Now, that's not the worst option. There are some people who take that approach, but consider this. If you're okay at reading sheet music, and you're okay at figuring stuff out by ear, and you're okay at memory, and you're just okay at everything, then your ability to find a piece of music and understand it and get it into your head and learn it and then physically perform it is going to just be okay. Like, these things don't really stack. You have to take one path from start to finish, or at least you're going to be limited by whatever path happens to be your strongest. So think about that as you do this. Now, you will want to experiment with different things, of course. You don't want to be completely isolated. But I think it is best to have one thing that you really focus on. Because if you ever want to get to where you're playing difficult, complex music, the kind of thing that sounds really cool and people find impressive, if you ever want to get there, you need a way of getting that into your head, and you need a lot of time that you can spend just sitting there practicing it and physically doing it. And if you're not that great at reading, you're not that great at figuring it out, then you're never really going to get to where you can work on this very difficult music. So just consider that as you go into it. All right, so the way we'll do this, I want to take 3 different passes at everything. We'll start with the perspective of learning other people's music, and then why you would choose one of these methods over the others. Then we'll come back and look at improv, and then at writing your own. So let's start with other people's music. Now, these are your options for learning it: written, visual, or auditory. So let's talk about sheet music first, because this is a kind of a sticking point for a lot of people. Sheet music is weird. It's very weird. You tend to think of it like it's just the written version of music. Like, oh, I'm going to learn to play music and hear it, and I'll just learn to read it and write it. Like, that seems obvious. In the same way that, you would, if you learn to speak and hear English, you learn to read and write it too. Like, easy enough. But music is not like that. Sheet music doesn't correspond directly to any given instrument. It's more of an abstract kind of written music. Like, take this, for example. This is a really simple jazz piece, and we talked a little bit about how jazz works last week, but ignore the extra stuff here. There's some chord progressions, there's a bunch of extra lines and whatnot. Just there's some simple notes written out on a staff. This doesn't tell me what to do directly. I can't look at this and go, oh, that means I put my finger here. I have to look at the music and understand how to read the music. And I'd say, okay, it's telling me to play a B flat, and then I have to figure out, how do I make a B flat happen on my instrument? And that's going to be different depending on what I play. So with written music, there's actually 2 steps. The first is to understand the music. The second is to translate that into whatever it is I want to play. So if you're considering whether or not you ought to learn to read music, it's going to depend a lot on how difficult that second step is. Because sometimes it's not that bad. If you play trumpet, for example, you tend to think of every note in its like musical name. Like, if I do this with my fingers and I do this with my mouth, then I'm making a G, or I'm making an F, or whatever. And so when you learn to read music, you learn that, oh, this note is a G. That means I play this note that's a G. And it's a monophonic instrument, so it can only play one note at a time. So the music never really gets too complicated. So if you're going to learn trumpet, learning to read sheet music is not that bad of an experience. If you're going to play something like, say, guitar, learning to read sheet music on guitar is miserable. I went to school and did my degree in classical guitar, and the reading music part sucks because the reading music itself, like I said, isn't that bad, but the translation part is terrible. And people like to rag on guitar players for this. You'll hear this joke like, oh, how do you get a guitar player to stop playing? Give him some sheet music. But honestly, you should feel a little bit for guitar players. On a guitar, you don't tend to identify a note by its name. You tend to use things like it's on this fret in this position, or it's this far away from this other note. Everything's very relative and pattern-like. And so trying to figure out how to translate sheet music to a guitar is a terrible experience. There's multiple ways to play the same note, and sometimes you'll realize like, oh, I played all these notes here, and I actually need to play them up here if I'm going to do this next one, and it just winds up getting really complicated. So if you're a guitar player, the translation step part of the sheet music reading experience is very, very hard. And that is why there's this whole alternative way of learning music or written music for guitar players, which is tablature. So tablature is one of these alternative forms. So here's what, again, I showed you this last time, but here's what tablature looks like. Tabs show you exactly where your finger needs to go on your instrument. And the parallel for this on piano is something like piano roll, where you have these little bars that show you, play this note and then play that note. And that's kind of what this is. So it cuts out the whole translation step. This is written directly for the instrument that you play. You can't play tabs on a saxophone or guitar tabs on a saxophone unless you go backwards and figure out, what you're playing on a guitar and then what note that corresponds to and then how to play that on your sax. So that's what these things are. In the piano world, the piano roll is a okay way to learn if you can find music like that. The problem though is that there's not a whole lot out there as far as learning things with the piano roll, so you probably won't get much mileage out of that. In the guitar world though, depending on your style, if you play classical, most stuff is written in sheet music, so that's just the reality. But if you play almost anything else, if you play metal or rock or pop or whatever, you'll find a lot of tabs. And in most cases, unless you have a different reason for learning to read sheet music, you want to learn the tabs. They are a million times easier. So those are your considerations there. For the most part, though, especially if you have one of those, easier to read sheet music on instruments like almost anything besides guitar and sometimes piano, you usually just learn to read the sheet music. There isn't actually that much else that's out there. Now, the visual method. This is, having somebody show you how to play. This is a wonderful method if you're just starting out because you don't have to deal with any of this other stuff. This is especially great if you have an instrument that's very hard to play. Like for a violin, it's hard to make even a single note sound good on a violin. So if you can do this, just have somebody show you, hey, put your finger here and do this with your bow or whatever, then you can just focus on the remembering music part and the performance part. You don't have to deal with all this stuff at once right off the bat. So that can be a great option. The problem, though, is that it won't get you very far. So unless you are wonderfully wealthy and you can afford to pay some private servant to show you every song you're ever going to want to learn, hours and hours every day, you can't really do that long term. Now, you could use, I've actually seen some people get a lot of mileage out of just watching things on YouTube and seeing somebody show you how to play a song. But at some point, the music starts to get too complicated to even figure out that way. You can't actually see every little thing that someone's doing, and you kind of run out of steam even taking that approach. So this, very good approach if you're starting out, especially if you have a hard instrument, but it won't get you very far. You'll eventually have to switch into doing something like sheet music. Now, the auditory approach, this can be a little bit mixed. Early on, depending on the type of music, sometimes if it's very simple, you won't have too hard of a time picking it out. You can figure out how to play it, and then it also kind of cuts out some of this extra stuff. But the more complicated the music gets, the harder this becomes, and it almost gets exponentially more difficult. If you have a really crazy piece with lots of things happening at once, it eventually becomes just about impossible to figure it out by listening to it. So this is not a very good long-term approach, and it's not as easy as just having somebody show it to you either. So it's not a great approach when you're doing the learn other people's music type of method. If you're doing improv or writing your own, then this is a very different story, but we'll get to that. So the bottom line, if you're going to be learning other people's music, is you may want to do this at the start if you can. That can be really nice, but eventually you're going to be learning written music, and you'll have to decide how you want that to work. Like I said, for a guitar player, you may just want to learn tabs, but in most other cases, you will wind up learning sheet music. So let's move on to the next part. Memory versus, sight reading or reading stuff off of a paper. If you're getting bored and you want to skip ahead, the short version is learn to memorize. Get really, really good at memorizing, especially if you're learning someone else's music, because usually your whole goal is to be, playing progressively more difficult things. And if you have that memorized, that is the strongest possible way to play. What I mean is, if you're reading something off of a paper, you're very limited. You can't do things that are very, very complicated. But if you have it memorized, that's like reaching your maximum potential for playing something physically. It's in your head. It's like the shortest path you could possibly take from getting something into your fingers. If you're reading it, you have to do this stuff. You have to read the music and understand it and translate it and figure out where that goes on your instrument. Now, the reason you might want to do that, take the sight reading approach, is one, if you're in a situation where you need to play a lot of relatively simple music. So say you're a piano player and you make a living by accompanying people who are singers or something. So, every couple days you have a gig where somebody hands you music and you have to be able to play it very quickly, but it's not terribly difficult. You're kind of just backing somebody up. And so your survival depends on you being able to very quickly play this stuff. Sight reading can be a huge help there. You don't have to take the time to memorize everything. It's not that hard to begin with. You can just play it. If you're in an orchestra, I kind of gave this example last time, but if you're in an orchestra and you might have some fairly difficult parts, but a lot of the music you play is just kind of waiting, or it's very simple notes, being good at sight reading is a good option there. But if your focus is performing, playing difficult things, you want to get really, really good at memorizing. And in most cases, even if you're just a soloist, if you're a piano player, you're going to play music that's in front of you, most people tend to rely way too much on the reading part. They'll have the music in front and they think that they're going to be using that when they perform, but really you usually want to memorize that. And sometimes having the music in front of you works like a crutch. It can actually make it worse because you feel this security of having music, but in reality, like, you can't actually read it off the page and play it. So you're better off just trusting your memory and relying on that fully. All right, so let's back up for a minute and take a look at things from the improv angle rather than the play somebody else's music angle. Now, technically, in its purest form, if you were to 100% improvise, where you're not taking anything from anybody else, you're just making everything up off the top of your head. If that's what you were doing, you could kind of short circuit this whole process. You don't need a way of getting music into your head if it's starting in your head, and you don't really need a way to store it if it's just all happening in the moment. So technically, you could just go directly from making stuff up to playing it. Now, in reality, that's almost never what happens. You're really never purely making everything up. You always would have, even if you are doing all your own stuff, you have fragments of music that you've kind of worked out before and are in your head, and you're kind of mixing it up in different ways. There's always this little bit of familiarity. So you're, even in that scenario, relying a good bit on memory. But pretty often when you're improvising, you are taking somebody else's music and just adding to it and working with it. That's super common. Like I said, that's usually what happens in jazz. So you do have to have some way of getting this music into your head, but it's not nearly as big of a challenge. So for example, here's that jazz piece again. Now I know it looks busy, but ultimately, the actual melody line there is very simple. There's a chord progression, and I kind of skipped this last time because, like I said, if you're reading chords, you are improvising at least a little bit because you have to decide where exactly to put those notes and how you're going to transition from one chord to the next. So you are at least a little bit injecting your own music there. So if you're taking this approach of this kind of mixed improv, reading sheet music is not that big of a deal. It's never really that complicated. Compare this to something like this. This is a Chopin piece written for piano. There's a lot going on here, and this isn't even like a super difficult piece, and there's still a lot that happens. So comparatively, learning this stuff, really not that big of a deal. This, learning this kind of thing will take a lot of work to get good at. So learning to read sheet music when you're improvising, not that big of a deal. Learning the chords, you would almost certainly want to be learning the chord progressions because if you're improvising, you're going to be thinking a lot about chords anyway. I mean, chords are just when you play notes together and learning about how they sound. So you want to be very aware of chords if you're doing improv. So of course you're going to learn to read chord charts. Now the alternative methods of written music like tabs and piano roll and things like that don't usually apply very much to improv. It's pretty rare that you'll find a jazz piece written out in tablature because the sheet music really isn't that bad, and tabs and piano roll kind of revolve around telling you exactly where to play something, either here or on your guitar or whatever. And you don't really want to take that approach when you're improvising. You want to have some freedom and you're making up your own thing. So they just rarely ever apply to doing improv. Now, as far as the visual approach, having somebody show you, that doesn't make much sense either. I mean, technically you could have somebody show you this melody and you could learn it and go from there, but again, it mostly revolves around you making stuff up. So having somebody show you doesn't really work that way. Auditory, though, learning things by ear, usually plays a huge role in improvising. That is something you would want to be good at because oftentimes you're improvising, you're hearing something and you want to play that back, or you're going to hear what somebody else does and work off of that, or you just kind of have something in your head and you're trying to get that to come out on your instrument. So the auditory connection gets to be really important with improv. Now, it can depend a little bit on your style, but that is going to be a huge focus if you're improvising. So I know I sort of made it seem like you really need one way to get through this, but that doesn't necessarily apply if you're improvising. You actually usually want multiple methods with improv. But like I said, this stuff like reading sheet music is only ever pretty simple. If anything, your biggest focus is usually on hearing things and just the practice of listening to stuff and figuring it out can do a lot to help the actual musician part, like developing that connection between what something sounds like and how you're going to play it. So if you're focusing on improv, this is a very good one to focus on. Now the storage part, again, the sight reading stuff doesn't apply a whole lot because mostly you're making up your own thing. Memory, though, is important, believe it or not, because when you improvise, you really want a lot of stuff that you can kind of bank on. You have certain phrases and ideas that are all shoved in your head, and even if they're not super spelled out, you do still want that there. So you don't necessarily have to be incredible at memorizing things like you might if you're, a piano soloist, but it is still something you're going to rely on a lot. So generally speaking, if you're taking the improv approach, you'll focus a lot on learning things by ear, or you should. You'll focus quite a bit on chord charts, a little bit of sheet music, and then a lot of memory. So that's something you want to think about there. And we won't get into too much detail, but as far as the subcategories of memory, using things visually, using things auditorily, mostly you'd want to be using auditory memory when you're improvising. Because again, you want that strong connection between what something sounds like and what you're actually going to play. If you're improvising, you have to know if what you're about to play is going to work with whatever happens to be going on musically. So that's usually your approach to improv. And we'll get into more details about improv later. All right, so now let's take a look at writing your own music. Now, this is its own world unto itself, so I can't really cover every possible thing because ultimately you get to decide a lot about how you write music and how you share it or how you record it or anything. But here's some basic thoughts on this. If you're writing your own music and your intention is to play it yourself, and that's it, then you don't necessarily have to worry about this kind of stuff, writing sheet music or reading sheet music or showing somebody else or anything like that. You could make up a song, you could sit here and work stuff out and decide what you like, and eventually transfer that right into your memory. You make it up, you memorize it as you go, and eventually you've got this whole song that you know how to play. So you could take that approach. Now, obviously, if you're going to ever want to share it with somebody else, you either need to write it down using really whatever method you choose. I mean, it's your music, so if you're a guitar player, you can decide to write it in tablature, you can decide to write it in sheet music, or whatever you like. So if you want to communicate it, you're going to need something like this. It's possible to record it, and if it's simple enough, you could potentially expect other people to be able to figure it out. But like I said, if things start to get complicated, this doesn't really work so well. And then, of course, you could show somebody else physically. Now, this method, I make something up and I show somebody else. This works great if you're like in a band or something. If you wrote a bass part and you want to show it to your bass player, simplest way is to just show them. But of course, you're limited. You can't really share it with, the big wide world of people on the internet or whatever. So you'll probably want to learn how to do one of these things, usually sheet music, unless you're in a specific scenario like you're a guitar player and you want to do tabs. However, like I said, if you don't intend to share stuff, you could just memorize things, but your memory has limits. If you memorize a piece now, odds are you're not going to you won't have it still in your memory 5 years down the road. And if it's something you wrote, that's terrible. That means it's gone. Like if the only place it existed was in your head and you can't remember it anymore, that piece has died and it no longer exists in the world. So you almost always want to have some way of recording stuff. Now you can use sheet music if that's your intention, to just record something, but you would actually be surprised how difficult it is to write something in sheet music. Reading sheet music is fairly difficult. Learning to write it is way harder. And if you ever sit down with a blank sheet of, staff paper and think, how do I get this sound that I've made up down on paper? You'll start to appreciate how hard that really is. So that is a method, but you can also just record stuff. And usually, if you're writing music, you tend to be good at the, playing by your auditory connection. Same thing with improv. And that can help you a lot in learning, if something sounds like this is how I make that sound on my instrument. It gives you a good connection between what you do and what it sounds like. So this is a good thing to have in your repertoire anyway. But if you're taking this approach where I've written stuff, I need to get it down somewhere so it doesn't disappear, you can record it. And then usually later, you'll at least have a little bit of memory left on this piece, and you can listen to it and figure it out from there. So this can be a very good option if you're just intending to record things, and I mean like save in permanent storage for stuff you've written. So if you're writing your own, that's generally my recommendation. Focus a lot on the auditory connection because that's very helpful to you anyway. Focus on memory. Sight reading doesn't really apply here. And if you want to share stuff, usually sheet music, maybe something else. And then if you have music that's intended to be somewhat improvised, you can do the chord chart kind of thing. Like I've made up this chord progression. You can decide exactly how you want to play it, and maybe you figured out a melody. You're like a singer-songwriter. You can let other people figure out exactly how to play the chords, and you could take that approach too. Again, it depends a lot on what you want to do. So let me see if I can sum all this up for you and give you a sense of what to expect if you choose one thing over the other. If you choose to focus on other people's music, that typically means you're going to rely a lot on written music. Usually sheet music, could be tablature if you're a guitar player and you play the right style. Chord charts don't really apply here. Piano roll, like I said, I've seen some people do okay with this, but typically it won't work in the long run. The visual method, having someone show you, awesome at the start, not good long term. And by that, I mean, that's a great approach to take. Do this at first, give yourself some time to focus on the performance and the memory, and then transition to written. The learning by ear, auditory stuff, also will run out of steam at some point. But if you intend to also do some improv or writing your own music, or you want to transition to that later, this can be a good thing to spend some time on. It ties in really nicely to these things. As far as the storage stuff, memorize. Absolutely. We'll get into more detail about which particular method of memory to use, but this is going to be a huge thing that you're going to want to be very, very good at. The reading off the paper method, you would use that if you're going to be playing a good bit of easy music. Like this can happen in an orchestra, this can happen if you're accompanying somebody or whatever. Mostly though, not something you're going to do a whole lot of. And I didn't really mention this before, but keep in mind that sight reading, reading music for the first time without stopping and, doing it fluidly is a very different skill than just being able to read music. Certainly it can help you a lot, learning to read, but it is a bit of a different thing, and it's not usually something that plays a big part in, this particular approach of just learning music. If you do this, other people's music and you memorize and all this stuff, this is the strongest route to playing complex, difficult, impressive music. If that's what you want, is to be a very good player in the physical performance sense, this is the strongest, best way to get there. If you are going to focus on improvising, now this could mean a lot of different things. Oftentimes it means playing in a jazz group where you have this sort of loose connection with the song you're playing and you're making stuff up. A lot of bands tend to do this, just if you're in some kind of rock jam band type thing. A lot of church groups have a little bit of a similar approach. They take chords, you kind of figure out your own part. All of that stuff kind of fits into this category. If you do this, you usually need at least a little bit of sheet music, but mostly you're going to be relying on hearing things by ear, and that's something you want to be pretty good at, and that will help you a lot with your improv in general. Memory plays some part in this, but not nearly as much as playing other people's music. If you do this, you can expect to be pretty flexible. You can play in a group pretty comfortably, and it ties in relatively well if you want to write your own music. Being good at that ear connection can help you a lot. But a lot of your time is going to be spent on just getting good at making things up and having to focus on what you're playing, and you won't be the same type of performer as if you just play other people's music and you focus on getting really good at that. So that's your options there. And then if you write your own, some people write their own music and don't even perform it at all. You don't actually even have to. So you will have to spend a great deal of your time writing. Music theory plays a part of this, certainly listening by ear and making that connection. You may be learning sheet music if you want to share stuff that way, but you don't necessarily have to. So if you're writing your own, you're going to spend a lot of time in your own little universe, and you will not be the same type of performer as you would be otherwise. Now, again, you don't have to stick with one approach all the way through. You may switch at some point when you realize that, okay, this is what I'd really like to do, or hey, I've been playing other people's music for a while, my performance is pretty good, now I'm going to switch into writing your own. But you do want to focus. You do want something to take you through this and help you play and develop those skills. And like I said, I think it's a bit of a mistake to try to do everything all at once, unless that's just really the approach you want to take and you're okay with relatively slower progress on any given one thing. All right, I know this was a very high-level discussion of this stuff. next lesson, the final lesson in this small series, will be a bit more concrete about, now that you have an approach, or hopefully you have an approach, how do you translate that into what do I do day to day? How do I get good at doing this stuff? So that will be what we look at next week. In the meantime, thanks for watching, especially if you made it this far. I know this is a lot of stuff that I'm throwing at you. Check out my Patreon if you want to help support things.